Hello, everybody, and welcome to July 2021 question time here in Virtual Legality. Please, as you come in, let me know if you can hear me on this microphone. I always like to do that check before we get started. But as I wait for that, if you aren't familiar with this is our live, hopefully a little less formal question and answer session that is done every month and is made possible by the wonderful patrons of Hoeg Law YouTube channel, of Patreon. And there's a tier at Patreon that allows you to get access to question time, to ask questions. And we do those questions first in this space. But we also do questions and conversations about anything that we've talked about from the community once we're done with those patron questions. Because this is going to be about an hour-long show. We're going to be talking about all sorts of things. I would guess it was a really light week in video game news. Certainly a light month in virtual legality, right? No? It wasn't? Yeah, some big stuff has happened in the video game industry of late, so I suspect some of you will want to talk about that. I'm all for it, and anything else that you have. Before we get started with the questions, I do want to thank, as part of this video, our July Patreon sponsors. You probably saw their names earlier this week if you checked out one of our videos. They are Tavern Keeper and Dragon Girl, who have been keeping the lights on here now for a number of months, and I could not express my appreciation more for that. If you are interested, as I said, in sponsoring either at the question time tier, something less, at the sponsorship tier here like Tavern Keeper and Dragon Girl, please do check out that Patreon page. Now, we did get a number of questions from the patrons. I'm going to answer 3 from a single patron because this person is also keeping the lights on here at question time and is giving many questions that we can answer, in part, some of which will probably be appearing next month, I would guess. And I'm very thankful for that as well. One of the first questions is, and I love this one, why do legal documents tend to have so many run-on sentences? And is that more of a modern mentality, or is it a repercussion of something? And I think the answer to that, why does legalese exist? Why do contracts look the way they do? Why do you describe things like in a statute and just go for word after word after word after word, trying to say the same thing? I think the answer to that is that the legal practice, the contractual practice, is effectively risk aversion as a profession. You know, what you're trying to accomplish when you write a statute, when you write contract terms, when you're otherwise drafting something from a legal basis, is that you're trying to consider every possibility of things that could go wrong. And we know that that's impossible. We can't predict the future. We can't future-proof everything in a document. But you don't want to be the attorney that knows of something, could have included it in a series with commas or semicolons, and neglected to do so, and then have that specific one be the thing that comes back at you in a deposition or lawsuit or malpractice case, whatever it might be. And so you're always thinking for the client about what I've called, I think in virtual legality even, the parade of horribles, the things that could possibly happen that could go terribly wrong for you. And so when you say, hey, here's how we're going to describe, say, intellectual property rights, you describe it for 4 sentences with commas and semicolons because you don't want somebody somewhere to say, they didn't say design documents of this particular type. And so you wind up getting sentences that are clauses and nested clauses that try to articulate every problem. You would have seen this as a possibility if you looked at the channel just yesterday where we did a video on Black Widow versus Disney, where one of the questions was, hey, if you say a wide theatrical release is something that the studio is required to give you, is that accomplished? Are they satisfying their obligations in the agreement if they release your movie in a large number of theaters and also release it at home at the same time? And Black Widow, Scarlett Johansson, and her team want to argue that no, a wide theatrical release is exclusive to theatricality. However, that word doesn't appear to be included in the contract itself. At least I would hope from the plaintiff's side, if it did appear in the contract, they would have mentioned that in their complaint. Since they didn't do so, I think we can assume that it doesn't appear there, although they could always amend later. And if it doesn't appear there, well, you've got a problem. If you're Scarlett Johansson's representation, if you're the lawyers, you have to argue that, well, everybody knew that this meant exclusive. That's a harder argument, obviously, than, see here, Your Honor, this word here, exclusive, it means exclusive. And so when you're lawyering, when you're talking about sentences and run-ons and poor grammar for how to live your life, how to write a novel, it's really about trying to articulate possibilities in a way that minimizes, if not eliminates, loopholes or potential problems down the line. That's why you see sentences that way. The next question is, can you run through the legal process of mergers and acquisitions of what is fundamentally changing or being changed as part of that process? And I think this is a great question because I think people get a little bit confused. Heck, even people that are sophisticated in business but don't necessarily acquire companies or sell their own companies have this question, because when you merge entities, both entities essentially survive. There are statutes in Delaware, which is where you most often see these kinds of transactions occur, and maybe that's a question for another time, and the other states of the United States, as well as other countries, that effectively say, when you merge entities, everything that existed that related to that entity before gets merged into the new entity. So those contractual obligations you have, those are still the obligations of the new entity. Whatever debts you might owe, those are still the debts of the new entity. A merger is not ending or ceasing the existence of the prior entity as much as it's becoming something new. So from a legal ramifications perspective, when you talk about something as a merger, that's what's happening. Now, it's also the case that journalists aren't necessarily making the distinction between mergers and acquisitions in a way that's the best, the most useful to the readers or to the listeners. And you can see that with something like Xbox merging with Bethesda, right? They describe it as a merger. There's nothing wrong with that because Xbox used a merger agreement. Microsoft did in order to accomplish it. But as we saw with some of the reporting when that story went into place, that merger was effectively just a way to buy Bethesda. And when they did a merger, what they meant was it was what we called, and we did a video on it, a reverse triangular merger, in which what happens is Microsoft drops down an entity, in that particular instance called Vault, and they use Vault to merge into Bethesda. And then once that merge happens, because Microsoft owns all of Vault, Microsoft owns all of Bethesda when it's done. So it's essentially an acquisition. So there, yes, Vault and Bethesda merge and it's the same kind of entity. You don't lose anything from Bethesda. But what was actually accomplished in the corporate side of things is that Microsoft owns Bethesda, and you accomplish acquisitions in a great many circumstances with a merger for reasons that relate to tax or relate to the consents or government approvals that would be required for actually moving the entity in and of itself. So you do that for structural reasons, and that's going to be different for basically every single corporate transaction, certainly one of that size. But when we talk about mergers themselves, you're not changing the entity. You're continuing on in a new name. And in fact, if you go and you look at contracts pre-merger from contracts after a merger, those contracts that have a different name, they don't have to be amended. They just continue on in the new name. You're a successor in interest to that original party to the contract. I hope that helps. And finally, from the patrons, with the PSP and PS Vita shops almost closure of the digital storefront, what legal rights do users have, if any? Is there anything stopping Sony or any digital storefront from completely closing up shop and leaving users in the wind with no means to access previous purchases? And I think probably even the question asker knows the answer to this particular question, because as we look at this in virtual legality, we know that the entities, Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, anybody else, are doing their level best to protect themselves, to go out there and to make sure that if they need to do something that's in their best business interest, then they have the right to do it. And we can also assume, not that companies don't breach contracts or otherwise, but we can also assume that when it happens, when it's made publicly, like the PS Vita store closure, certainly Sony thinks they have the rights. And we can go and we can find out why they think they have those rights. Now, we're looking now at the PlayStation Network terms as they exist today. Technically speaking, the terms that actually will cover your specific relationship on a specific game purchased or a specific service used are those that were in place when you used them, when you bought them, and then they're later amended as you continue to use them or to access them. But assuming that something like this existed when the PlayStation Vita was initially sold, you can see here how Sony covers itself for things like this. We've got here Section 12 of the current PlayStation Terms of Service, PlayStation Network Terms of Service. And it says, we may suspend or terminate online access to certain network features or services as may be reasonably necessary to protect Sony interests. And you can see I highlighted that and I read it there as just the operative sentence that we need. You can also see, just like that first question here in Virtual Legality, they've got a lot extra here. It's also a little bit difficult for non-lawyers to read it this way, right? You go and you find the operation, you go and make the sentence exactly the way you want. And if you imagine this is even longer than this, you know, something that's a bigger paragraph or even longer, it's sometimes hard to see that this provision actually says this. We may suspend anything we want to protect our interests. Sure. Okay, Sony, that's fine. And this is one of the arguments that you have with respect to keeping games historically and the digital future for video games, where almost every service is going to have something like this in their terms and conditions that says we can do whatever we want. We don't have to keep that server live. We don't have to keep that store live. We don't have to keep that hardware actually being manufactured or serviced. And yeah, at the end of the day, you get into a situation where, okay, if you have a Vita, they're closing up shop. Yeah, Sony's absolutely allowed to do that. And you don't have to like it. In fact, part of the reason that I do Virtual Legality is to highlight things like this that people ask me questions about, to go through these documents, not to necessarily advocate for specific issues with any given provision, but to make sure people know that this is the way that they operate, so that if they decide that they want to have an issue with it and this gets reported on, and people in general have an issue with this kind of strength of keeping the rights that Sony has to turn things off, or that anybody else, Electronic Arts, Activision, anyone else, has with respect to their products to turn things off, that we say, maybe we need to start pushing for different terms, different obligations and rights that we might otherwise have in those contracts. So the very short answer is, yeah, they have the right. The longer answer is, yes, they put those in the terms of service. And the longer answer still is, you know, maybe that's something that should be addressed if things like the PS Vita shop or PSP shop turning off is important to people that are trying to preserve that history of video games. And those are the patron questions for today. And I very much want to thank the patron that submitted those. I always love getting those questions. That's the purpose of question time. That's the purpose of giving a benefit in Patreon to those folks, is to be able to ask those questions. But since we did those three, now I want to open up the floor, as we like to say in corporate land when we've got a board meeting or other kind of meeting. Open up the floor to take questions from the community. I can see that there are a number of you in here. Please do like. The algorithm loves those likes to tell people that we're having this video right now. Otherwise, I always appreciate it if you get my attention with an @Hoeg Law, or we've got super chats, of course, but please don't feel any obligation to do that at all. And we can answer some questions here, and hopefully we'll have some fun. Okay. Let's see. We can hear you. The mic's working. That's great. When there's a contract that doesn't define a term, for example, if the Disney Johansson contract just says theatrical release, I believe it probably says wide theatrical release, it appears in quotes there. How is that usually litigated and interpreted by the courts? Well, that's a great question. So the courts are basically there to try to ensure that there's a meeting of the minds. And so what Scarlett Johansson and her team will try to present in evidence is the historical and industry-wide fact that wide theatrical release has always and forever been interpreted as an exclusive wide theatrical release. And they would be looking for potentially news items, other testimony that suggested that that was understood by major industry players. They might even also bring up Kevin Feige, who I understand, at least is being reported on, doesn't love what Disney did here. Marvel, even though it's owned by Disney, obviously has different people at it. Disney is a different entity than Marvel. And so they might present that. The Disney side of things might present instances where they have contracts that say wide theatrical release, and they were also released on a rental basis on a digital service or on a streaming service. They might point to Warner Brothers and say, here's what happened. Now, Scarlett Johansson's team might point to them as well, as they do, in fact, in that complaint, and say, no, they amended their contracts. And so that creates a problem for Disney, because they might say, well, maybe they didn't have to. And we don't necessarily have those contracts on the books. You'd have to do essentially subpoenas of that information. You'd get into a big old fight about that kind of thing. But the court is trying to figure out, when these two parties say this, what did they mean? Because a contract only exists when there's a meeting of the minds, and now you have here Scarlett Johansson and her team saying we never intended for it to allow streaming, and Disney saying, well, you know how to say streaming is prohibited and you didn't put it in that contract. So the court's going to be left looking at certain things. Now, importantly, as I mentioned in that video that I did yesterday, it's worth noting that they have a contract that almost certainly has a merger clause that says the entirety of this agreement between these two parties exists in the four corners of this document. So you bring in emails, you start to bring in, oh, we had that lunch that one time where you said, yeah, of course it'll only be in theaters. None of that should, in most circumstances, count as part of the discussion between those two parties. But you never know. You don't know what you don't know. And the court's going to have its own interpretation of these things. That's why in a perfect world, you're defining every important term to the maximal extent that you can, as I tell my clients, because some third party somewhere is going to be looking at this thing and trying to decide what it means. And so we want to have things as clear as possible, even if clarification in this instance, as we're signing the document, you might think goes against you. We want to make sure that each party has a full understanding of what is happening here, because getting into that fight later on is potentially troublesome. Disney thinks they had the right to do this. I would have probably negotiated with my stars on these kinds of things. Pandemic changed things. They could argue that, but we don't know what the court's going to ultimately decide. Personally, like most court cases, especially civil ones, I think it's going to settle. I don't know that it's very good for either of these sides to look like this, but Disney's statement was so kind of off kilter that I don't know whether they are in fact going to settle that claim. Thank you very much for the question, Admiral Adama. What else do we have here? Thoughts on several states banning gaming PCs. A number of you have asked me about that. There's a couple of things that are kind of in my virtual legality backlog now. The gaming PCs, the Warhammer stuff, that unfortunately I just haven't gotten the chance to research properly yet, because Activision Blizzard was just every single day doing things that needed a video made about them. So I would want to look at it. I will tell you this. I always see articles that say things like that in the headlines that are very specific about bans and things as worthy of additional consideration, worthy of reading more about what the law in question is, what is happening with respect to those specific stories. I have a tendency, and maybe this is just the lawyer in me, to say, it's probably not that clean. It's probably not just a ban of these kinds of things. So I'd want to look at that more, but unfortunately I haven't done that research now. I haven't looked at those documents as it stands right this second. So I'm unable to talk about the specific quote-unquote bans other than to say that it's definitely on my list to research at a later point in time. Just wanted to ask you if you think the remake of Simpsons Hit and Run is possible. Yeah, you know, that was a good Grand Theft Auto clone from back in the day. What is that, the PlayStation 2 era? I guess the question is, who owns the rights now? You, of course, had Fox changing hands to Disney. It's unclear what the intellectual property rights are for the actual developer and whether or not those would have to get untangled to make that game possible. Now, I certainly think, as you see EA making Dead Space, as you see everybody kind of going back to the well of potential things that they've made before, that Simpsons Hit and Run is one of those that could use a modern polish, and I think people would generally like. But I also don't know what the popularity of The Simpsons is right now. I have to be honest, I haven't watched The Simpsons really that much since I was in college. And so it's been a long time. I don't know what that popularity is, whether or not it makes sense to do another video game on that score, or to remake even the existing games. Certainly you don't see other Simpsons games that often. You had the mobile, what do you call it, tap game, where you tap on things and collect money, that I know was doing fairly well for a while. But I think there's potentially some intellectual property entangled in that, and there's just a question of will. Do people want to make that game? But thank you very much for the question. Let's see here. Hey, yeah, have you chatted about the Big 12 versus ESPN? No. You know, that would have, again, been a video probably with lesser video game stuff happening this week. For those of you that don't know, the University of Texas and Oklahoma are leaving one of the college football conferences. They are very, very big brands in college football. They're leaving it for the SEC. And ESPN, the broadcast partner for the SEC that owns the SEC network, has been accused by the Big 12 of essentially intentionally inducing a breach of the Big 12 contract by Oklahoma and Texas. And we don't know exactly whether there's more information there, why exactly the Big 12 thinks that ESPN was directly involved, whether they have some emails or phone calls or knowledge on that score. ESPN is very specifically trying to say, no, we did not intentionally interfere with any contracts. And maybe when that goes a little bit further, we'll wind up doing a video on it. It is, as a fan of college football, enormously interesting to see essentially a conference eaten up and trying to sue everybody that is responsible for their current plight. Thank you very much for the question. Have you seen the news about some GTA mods being taken down? Yes, I saw that. I read that. I don't know if it was earlier this week or last week. And I thought, yes, that's interesting. You know, that's the largesse question that we talk about in virtual legality, right? We've talked about the fact that most, if not all, streams and fan mods and, heck, sketches done of popular characters of video games and things are living in that gray area of publisher or intellectual property holder largesse, right? You've got something like Grand Theft Auto. You make these things. I believe they tried to take one down years ago, I think I read in the article, and ultimately the public reaction asked them to put it back up. But at the end of the day, the intellectual property holder doesn't have to abide by these things being out there. They are derivative works, almost definitionally, under the intellectual property laws. And so it's no surprise that at some point, the publisher says, this isn't useful to us anymore. And you can ask the question of why it isn't useful in this particular time period, but the answer might be that they're working on remasters of their own, right? One of the reasons you get protection under something like fair use, which doesn't apply to a full conversion mod, a derivative work of an existing game, is that you get fair use because you aren't impacting the market, the commercialability of that intellectual property held by the actual owner. When the owner says, okay, now you are, I get the right to take things down. And they always had that right. But they want to sell things, and so they want to take it down when, hey, they think they want to sell something into the market right now. The other thing that happens, and I've talked about this before, is they don't like how it's associated or done. And so they say, okay, we don't like that you're treating this game in this respect. You're making political commentary. You're doing something else with it. And so we could potentially take it down as a derivative work at that point in time. You're putting our characters in lascivious positions. While that might exist on the internet, certainly the intellectual property holders have the right to try to curb that if they can. So the GTA thing strikes me as something that was always possible to be done. Why it's happening today is perhaps the more interesting question. But we don't know that until we see potentially what they might be releasing as a remaster. We got a couple of super chats, which I very much want to thank folks for. We've got a super chat from Kaz Has Band-Aids. Have you talked about how Emma Stone might sue Disney for her Cruella movie for similar reasons Scarlett has? I haven't, because I just did that video yesterday with respect to Black Widow, and I think the Emma Stone thing looked like it happened while I was setting that up and researching it and recording it. Certainly, if Disney's standard contract is wide theatrical release, and Emma Stone looks at her contract, tells her reps to look at it, and sees the same thing, and they come back and say, well, you've got the same language, do you want to sue on the same basis? That is a possibility. Now, I still think, if you looked at that video, that Scarlett Johansson does not have the easiest case here. It's not impossible. They make some good points, and they could very well win. But it's not as easy as pointing to an exclusivity provision in your contract. So Emma Stone might be evaluating that. The other thing that happens is, as you saw, this is a bit of a bridge burner. This is essentially Scarlett Johansson and Disney divorcing fairly messily, and Emma Stone may not want to take such a strident step against what is one of the biggest media companies in the world, because Emma Stone intends to have a continuing relationship. In fact, I think Cruella 2 was either announced as happening or in development, and so there's something to be worked out there as well. We also have another super chat from Ruby Rudy. Why are doc titles so long? I'm a clerk in unlimited civil court for LA Superior Court, and I always have to turn 1,000 character titles into 255. I have no idea, honestly. So that's California. It sounds like practice measures for filing things in the court. I don't know why it would be so long. It would be parties. Oh, in terms of like evidentiary things. I strongly don't know why they would have to be so long, and I feel for you trying to turn 1,000 characters into 255, only from my limited experience in Twitter, trying to make cogent statements and then saying, oh, I need a number of extra sentences in especially legal questions. So I'm very sorry to say I don't know the answer to that question. I'm neither a California lawyer nor a litigator, but it certainly sounds like the kind of problem that clerks would definitely have with lawyers doing that kind of thing. I also know a number of lawyers that aren't particularly nice to the administrative bodies that have to do things like that. So on that score, I am sympathetic towards your plight and the job that you have to do for them. They're probably not appreciative enough. Let's see here. What's the next question here? As someone who's very legally illiterate, in your opinion, if I were hiring a lawyer, what should one look for? Well, I think the most important thing is one where you talk to them by meeting or Zoom contact, and you get a good feeling for who they are. There are a lot of good lawyers out there, a lot of lawyers that can take care of your needs. And the one thing that I tell my clients when I'm having that prospective client discussion is you have to feel comfortable with them. The legal relationship is almost like a doctor relationship. You have to be willing to talk about the warts, whether that's in a litigation, most certainly, but even on the business side. You know, I'm a business lawyer. I'm a corporate lawyer. I'm a transactions guy. And you have to be willing to talk about what your fears are, what your problems are, what you're hiding, what you don't want, what your weaknesses are, because if you can't have those conversations, you can't properly get the right counsel. So when you're having that conversation, you want to have the Zoom call, or you want to have the sit-down meeting, and you want to say, I am feeling good about this relationship. I have a trust of this individual. And that's part of the process. The other thing that I would recommend, and I recommend this to my prospective clients who always laugh at me for it, is you talk to a few. You talk to a few lawyers. Every lawyer, every decent lawyer worth their salt will give you 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes to talk about your situation, tell you about whether or not they think they can help, and usually what that cost might be. And you can have those conversations for 15 minutes with 2, 3 lawyers and then judge for yourself. It's an important relationship. So I always recommend that. And you can hopefully get a feel for whether or not this lawyer seems a little dumb. This lawyer seems a little bit full of himself. This lawyer is not going to work on the way I want him to work or the way I want her to work on my stuff. This lawyer wasn't responsive even when I was trying to set up that meeting. You can gather all of these clues from that. It's a little bit harder to evaluate the legal output, the legal deliverables. And so that's the real trick, is trying to find somebody that you can trust, that looks like they're getting the job done, and working with them in those conversations. Thank you very much for the question. Let's see here. I have obtained DVDs with dailies from a film production. Is this material copyright protected? Yes. Yes, it is. Everything that is created by someone somewhere is protected. They have an intellectual property right in the creation of that thing. It is copyright protected. Doesn't necessarily mean you can't use it. It would depend on the facts and circumstances and whether you could fall under fair use, if it's newsworthy, et cetera, et cetera. Definitely consult with counsel if you're going to try to commercialize that or otherwise make it public. But yes, everything that is created, that chat that you just created, you have an intellectual property in. Now you've licensed it away for purposes to YouTube and Google and to my uses as chatting to my channel directly, that kind of thing. You can go look at the terms of service. But when you do something, it's copyright protected. Let's see. What else do we have here? Are you optimistic about Jared Goff? I love the football questions today. Assuming you're a Lions fan, sorry about that. Everything there is true. I am a Lions fan. I deserve to be felt sorry for because the Lions are always terrible. Am I optimistic about Jared Goff? No. But then again, I'm never optimistic about the Lions as a life policy. So if the Lions do better than I think they will do, that'll be grand. It'll be gravy on the turkey sandwich of life in the fall here in Michigan. But right now, I assume he's going to be terrible, and anything better than that will just be a blessing. Thank you very much for the question. I will not be traumatized for the rest of the day thinking about how my Lions are almost certainly going to be terrible this fall. I look forward to your thoughts. I know a lot of us fans in the Hateful Eight. Oh, the Big 12. Yeah, I have dreams that this could lead to a lawsuit and antitrust action versus ESPN. Yeah, it would be really tough. I'd be interested to see what your commissioner has on it, honestly, because you don't usually make swings like that and basically accuse somebody of an intentional tort without something. But I do think there's a certain amount of desperation in the Big 12 that could also result in those kinds of emails. And ESPN is certainly big and capable of defending themselves on this front. So we shall see. Let's see. Blizzard's recent letter said they were taking efforts to diversify and protect equal opportunity, including non-binary. I'm non-binary, male-bodied, and I still feel a company like this would discriminate or not recognize that. How does one become recognized officially as a non-binary? You know, I don't know. I think that's going to depend on the jurisdiction. So if you are, well, I guess you don't say that you're working at Blizzard right now. So California is going to have different rules probably than Michigan or New York or Florida or Texas or Washington or anywhere else. In terms of identification, I don't know that, for instance, in Michigan, that there's a classification for that with respect to birth certificates or driver's license or anything like that. That'll probably be something that the legal groups are looking at, to the extent that that does become kind of a more acknowledged protected class, right? A lot of the stuff in these questions lives in places like the Civil Rights Act and the acts that are their kind of counterparts in the various states. And either by historical accident or for more nefarious reasons, those kinds of statuses haven't really been addressed by kind of legal documentation in the various jurisdictions. Thank you for the question. Hi, Mr. Hoeg. Do you like pickles? Yes. The question is dill or sweet, and the answer still remains yes. Although both serve very different purposes, of course, as we know here in this space. But yes, I will say this, you know, like a good chili or something like that. In my experience, pickles have a pretty wide range of satisfaction. You know, you can go and you can get a turkey sandwich. You're going to mostly like it every single time. You get a pickle. There are weak pickles. There are pickles that are just nothing, they're mostly cucumber, and they're really strong, really pickled pickles. And I prefer a stronger taste in my pickle, but thank you very much for asking. At Hoeg Law, have you ever watched Mad Max Fury Road? Yes, I have watched Mad Max Fury Road. This was recommended to me, wow, back in the earlier days of Big Law, and I went with a colleague of mine. And you know, here's what I'll say about it. Certainly a lot of big visuals, certainly a lot of interesting stuff. It was really getting lauded. It won a number of Oscars. And I just have to be honest on this. I'm not dissuading anybody from loving it. It didn't really click for me that much. I like a more layered narrative. I like something that has more moving pieces. I like to really have my brain thinking about a ton of stuff at once. And Mad Max is very focused, to its credit. And I think it's a good movie. It just never rose to that level of classic for me that I think a lot of people think of it as. But I definitely have seen it. I have the Blu-ray, and I have watched it a number of times. All right, let's see here. Second part to the pickle question. What is one of the most fun days you've ever had? Man, I might have to backburner that. I wasn't ready to be asked about fun days. Were there fun days before 2020, 2021? I don't know. You know, I can give the easy answers. Certainly, I had a great day on my wedding. On my wedding day, that was a fantastic thing, which was really all put together by my wife. So I can't take any credit for that, but it was fantastic, and I still remember it pretty often. I remember the big days. I remember the days when my daughters were born. But in terms of raw fun, you know, I think there was certainly one day where we had a pass to Universal down in Florida. We decided we were going to try to ride every ride using one of these VIP passes that they make you pay extra for. And that was really amusing to try to do. Now, I did get a little nauseous as that went on. So I don't know whether that was one of the most fun days ever, but it's certainly high up there. And I love E3 every year. You know, it was a decade ago when I told my firm, big law firm, big successful people, mahogany, dark suits, all the good stuff. Yeah, I'm taking a half day on the Monday of E3 because that's what I want to do. And that was when like really all the press conferences were that first day. And you know, that ultimately helped us get certain clients and talk to tech people and things like that. But the looks I got there were amusing. But those are certainly fun days. Thank you very much for the question. Let's see here. What else do we got? I lost my place. Steam Deck, yes or no? Yes, already on pre-order. I think I said that in the video. That was in. There are things that are announced that you see, and in my opinion, you go, oh yes, that will work, and I would like one, please. So I'm on pre-order there. We'll see when they launch. I'm not assuming until next year for at least mine. I don't know what Valve's going to do in terms of putting those out there, but that's something that definitely works for me as someone that wanted to switch, wanted to play games with a little bit more power. And that's really one of the reasons why the lack of a Switch Pro was disappointing to me, not because there were promises made by Bloomberg. You know me. It's virtual legality. I'm not listening to the media as guaranteeing anything on basically any score of any kind, but that the Switch has games that I like to play that could be a little bit better with a little bit more frames and have a little bit more clarity, and the Steam Deck appears to do that. Now, as far as I understand it, we put down the $5 or whatever. We'll be able to evaluate it when it gets out into the wild a little bit. I also take with a grain of salt something like IGN First, not because they're doing anything wrong, but because that relationship is designed to show the product in the best light. And I would love to see it actually out in hands and being evaluated by Digital Foundry or wherever on a more kind of production-based basis with it out there in the wild. And then if I decide not to buy it, I won't. But as a product concept, I love it. Love it. I love it. What's your favorite legal drama and why is it Better Call Saul? It's good. It's good phrasing there. So Better Call Saul is fantastic, right? And I think we all saw Bob Odenkirk had a heart attack, but he's tweeting now, and it seems like he's going to be okay. Always worry about those kinds of circumstances, especially when they're so sudden and everybody goes quiet. So that was a good resolution to that story. Better Call Saul's absolutely fantastic. Breaking Bad is perhaps my favorite television show of all time. It's a wonderful role. The one thing I will say as a complaint about Better Call Saul, and this isn't really specific to the show, is that you do get into the circumstances where the lawyers in that show at the big firm, at the small firm, are all general practitioners in a way that doesn't make a ton of sense. And I always have fun with that because it's like, oh yeah, no, we'll handle this white collar crime case, and we'll handle this bankruptcy, and we'll handle this securities thing. Oh, and we'll handle this settlement with the mayor's office, and we'll handle all this other stuff. It's like, well, no, that's actually like 14 different lawyers at any given firm. Even Saul's brother wouldn't have quite the breadth that he's suggested to have, even in the capacity that he's shown in that show. But that's kind of the nature of television. You don't want to introduce every single associate or every single partner that you'd have there. I will say, especially, the arc when Saul goes and tries to be a good lawyer, when he goes to the other city and tries to be in a firm, and he's getting all the pushback from the associates and from the partners, and he's just not jiving with it. I can say that there have been days at Big Law where I felt basically all of those scenes. They were a little bit close to home for some days there during those airings. But I absolutely love the show. I'm certainly interested to see how it finishes. But that looks like it might get delayed a while, and certainly for good reason, because you can't have Better Call Saul without Saul. I'm having a fun day listening to Hoeg talk about pickles. See, question time. We can answer questions. Would you prefer the assumed MGS Metal Gear Solid remake be a close recreation of the original, like Shadow of Colossus, or take creative liberties? Oh, you're baiting me here. So, I think I would prefer a Metal Gear Solid remake to be a reimagining in the style of a Final Fantasy VII remake, but stopping short of what Final Fantasy VII Remake does, which is present itself as a time loop quasi-sequel. I would still want Metal Gear Solid to be Metal Gear Solid. I think that the original, it pretty much holds up today, so I don't think you need to just recreate that, remaster it. And you could do some fun stuff by introducing like Metal Gear Solid 5 open worldness to the concept. Here's a base break-in Alaska. But I would prefer they not go as far as Final Fantasy VII and say, oh, we're actually making a completely different game. Even though I think Final Fantasy VII Remake as a project is the best thing that Square has done in maybe decades. I still would prefer it if they hadn't gone and said, we're not actually making Final Fantasy VII anymore. But you would have heard that in my postmortem on Final Fantasy VII. And while that has changed only a little bit, because I love the Yuffie DLC as much as I do, it would be on my Game of the Year list if it's eligible. I'll have to talk to my brother at length about that at the end of the year, whether he's going to let me put it on that list or not. I do think that it goes too far on its baseline story. This is not a question. Oh, okay. But I wanted to express my gratitude for your videos. I found your channel thanks to the Blizzard lawsuit, and I'm really glad I did so. Informative is an understatement. That is super nice of you to say. Yeah, certainly the idea of virtual legality, when we're clicking, when we're working, is to get more and better information out there. And I think a lot of the journalism outlets, a lot of the people that are covering the Activision Blizzard story are getting good information out there. I think they're doing a lot of good work. Heck, man, I'm pretty critical of Kotaku in a lot of circumstances. I think the fact that they went and found that Facebook group and they found that and they interviewed some people, very, very useful, doing good work on that kind of thing. And I'm very thankful that you think it's educational, informative. I was worried about covering it at all, as you could probably tell from the number of disclaimers that I give, because of that relationship that I have with my brother at High Moon Studios, a subsidiary of Activision. So it was always one of those. It was always one of those things where I didn't want to get him in trouble, but it was so important that I felt that we needed to talk about it. So I just basically put up a firewall between myself and him and said we won't talk about it for purposes of these videos. But thank you very much. Law and Order is probably my favorite law drama. Well, I'll tell you, Law and Order is, there's a place for procedurals when you just want to watch a mystery. Law and Order is very, very good. I liked Law and Order when it was a little bit less likely to just take a modern story and kind of twist it around with a few different characters. And certainly I remember watching the Law and Order about like the harassing video gamers, and I thought, okay. But Law and Order, especially like the original Recipe, I really, really loved. So that's definitely a good show. Behind that is Better Call Saul. Yeah, very different shows, right? Better Call Saul, serialized drama, as much about the personal characteristics of the people as it is about legal questions. Law and Order, much more procedural, much more focused on those. And not once, now I've never been in a prosecutor's office, but not once did I ever, have drinks with the DA at the end and really grouse about what we did right and wrong in the case that day. So, I never got to participate in the Law and Order world, and I like to tell people when they ask me, what I do is I'm not Law and Order. I'm not presenting cases in court. Last time I was in court was either delivering a document in my big firm days or law school, where you go through and you watch procedure a little bit during that process. Make a DLC of the year list. It's not a bad idea, actually. I wonder what would be on that. It would be Yuffie, and then I don't know. Oh, I loved Ireland. Did Valhalla's Ireland come out this year? It'll be a short list. Highly recommend Ireland for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, especially if you find it too big in scope as a game in general, as I do. It's an excellent kind of small, I think it's 20 hours long, encapsulated version of Assassin's Creed in Ireland with a good story. It's one of Ubisoft's best in a while. Hello, what do you think about the Billy Mitchell versus Carl Jobst case? I haven't looked at it yet. It's on that list of things I have to potentially research and look at. One of the things in virtual legality was I thought I wouldn't have enough content. I didn't know whether I would have enough stuff to discuss with the stuff that I discuss, and it hasn't proven to be a problem, but it does mean that there's a list of things that I could look at, and I just haven't looked at that yet. So I apologize. Will you ever work together with Upper Echelon Gaming? Yeah, I think they refer to us a number of times. I DM'd him. I think he was kicked off of Twitter for reasons that I never got answers to. But yeah, I'm generally, as you could probably tell with me, I'm generally open to collaborations on legal issues, especially, obviously, with almost anybody. And I get into a little bit of trouble on this on the internet in some places. I like to get more and better information out there, and I like to get that information out there and talk to audiences, regardless of what you might think of one or more of the people that I'm having those conversations with, because I think reasonable minds can differ, and more importantly, that virtual legality is hopefully a beacon for that reasonable mindedness, and then we can get out there to audiences of all stripes. So I'm open to collaborations with mostly everyone. I do, you might not know this about my process. I was just mentioning this. I did a video with Legal Bites yesterday. I mentioned this, I think it was off camera, where I said, when people ask me, and a lot more people are asking me now, more often, especially with Activision Blizzard, but just in general, I do watch some of their stuff. I do watch a couple episodes, see what kind of personality they have. One of my things is I try to avoid appearing on shows that are just kind of swearing all the time. Not because there's anything wrong with that, and I don't mind the occasional use of helpful dialogue to explain one's feelings and position on something. But if it's just that, if it's, a bunch of locker room talk, whatever it is, I try to not necessarily appear in those circumstances. But I do like to appear on as many as I can, because I think the stuff that we're doing here, hopefully, if I'm feeling good about the content we're producing, is designed to be informative, educational, and get more critical reasoning and thinking about these issues out there. So yeah, I would be open to any kind of collaboration on that score. Also a place for Boston Legal. Yes. Yeah. Boston Legal is great. I mean, James Spader, William Shatner, what can you say? They do political screeds more often than most, but even those are presented in a fairly funny way. It would be interesting to hear your brother's thoughts and perspectives about this. All it's done in like a decade. Yeah, if he ever leaves, maybe, maybe we'll have him on. It's one of those things where it's like, I just felt it would be unfair to put him in that position. And so that's why I haven't done it that way. And I think a lot of you can understand that. Your thoughts on the chance of another COVID lockdown or mask-wearing mandate again? Mask-wearing mandate, I think, will happen. Lockdown, I don't think there's the political will. At the end of the day, these are all political questions here in the United States. And I just don't think there's there would be a political problem for most people in most jurisdictions to try to run a full lockdown again. I think mask mandate, perhaps, although, you know, I think there's a lot of political mistakes being made with respect to messaging, with respect to encouraging vaccinations, and the way that some of the stuff that comes out discourages them. So I don't like how most of the governments in the United States are dealing with this situation. I don't know how you might feel in your various other jurisdictions. That's where I come out. It's obviously a very difficult job, and you don't hear me talk about it a lot here in this space, not the least of which because Google and YouTube don't like you talking about those things in this space. But yeah, I don't think a lockdown will happen. I do think mask wearing mandate will happen again, which will have the effect of locking down certain industries. If Walter White would have been arrested and would be in court, how would you have defended him? Poorly. I'm not a litigator. Let's see, though. If we think about what happened with him, you'd go for some kind of plausible deniability. I mean, the problem you've got is, all right, so if Walter White is your client by the time that he gets caught at the end of that series, he's already completely gone in terms of narcissism. And so he might be able to brilliant himself up an argument, but the worry would be, especially on cross-examination, that he wants to be the one who knocks, right? And so defending him would be a problem. And in all likelihood, if you picked up that level of narcissism and kind of self-aggrandizement in your office, you'd say, I don't want this case. And, you know, you're hiring a lawyer. Lawyer's hiring you too. That's a symbiotic relationship. And if you pick up on that, maybe you don't take him on. Now, if you're Saul Goodman, well, you know, you go into your drawer of burner phones and your duffel bags full of dollars, and maybe you gin something up. But that's certainly not the way I practice law. And so I don't think that it would have been very easy to defend him, especially if Jesse comes out of the woodwork and testifies against him, because as you know, he just keeps getting away with it. Do you think Blizz will drain the swamp, settling their lawsuit and continue with new and better leadership, or will they fold? Be sold off to a new parent company? Is Blizzard too big to fail? Well, it's interesting how much of the stories relate specifically to Blizzard and not Activision Blizzard on the whole. You don't see the subsidiaries getting dragged into it very often, although California reserves the right with some of their language about affiliates and related parties, et cetera, et cetera. But what do I think is the most likely thing to happen? Well, I think a settlement will happen. What that looks like, I can't necessarily tell you, because when we talk about a settlement, it doesn't just have to be money. California can ask for any number of things with respect to that settlement. I do think that Activision Blizzard, the parent company, has to evidence a strong hand, that the investors, when they wobbled, were looking at leadership that wasn't doing enough to steer the ship of state, as it were. And so they're going to have to take a strong hand position, and that might be a settlement and looking like they're doing significant stuff. They're not really going to want to upturn the apple cart on what has been a productive relationship with Blizzard in terms of making money. So I think out of those two, you're going to see neither. You're not going to see a folding, and you're not going to see a drain the swamp. You're going to see some movement of the deck chairs and trying to get to a place where the spotlight moves on to somebody else. That would be my best guess on those kinds of things. But it's really a gambit of possibilities. And one of the things that will determine those is exactly what California is asking for and whether they want to make an example out of Activision. UEG has given you a few shout outs in the past month. Yeah, I thought so. I've seen people in the comments come in and say that. So I think that's great. I'm very thankful about that. And I would thank them on Twitter, but I don't think they're on there anymore. Very clear. Glad to hear you're interested in the Billy Mitchell case. I am. Yeah, I am. Twitter bot phrase is why Hoeg. No question, but hope you are doing good. Yeah, Saturday morning, one of my favorite days of the week. Going to have a fun one today. Any chance for Chris Chan to escape any form of punishment? I don't know that story. I am sorry to say. Glad to see the channel is growing. Yeah, no, the channel's taken off with Activision Blizzard. The dog days of summer are the dog days of summer, and I think, thankfully, a lot of people are getting out there and vacationing and hopefully enjoying the world a bit after certainly the last 18 months. But the views and subscribers were down for a while, and that's totally fine. totally fine. I just like to get good stuff out there, and the viewers will come. That doesn't worry me at all. After the Save the Kids mess, that's the FaZe Clan cryptocurrency issue. Why doesn't the SEC regulate the crypto scene? Well, Well, because the Securities Act and the Securities and Exchange Act are old, and it's not immediately obvious that crypto, and certainly specific kinds of crypto, are securities. Now, I think they are, and I think they ultimately will be determined to be that. But the SEC, like every other government agency, manned or womaned by lawyers, is risk averse. And so they take their time to decide whether something needs to be separately regulated. And I think crypto will be. But there are fights about whether it falls under those acts in their jurisdiction, and they have to be careful with asserting their rights under those acts, etc. Hey there, I like to watch your videos with some good coffee. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much. Wake you up in the day, get you ready going, talking about horrible, horrible things across video games. Apologies for that. We'll try to get some lighter fare in here as well. I have a question. How bad will it look to the court when Active Blizzard presents their gender pay gap disparity argument with ridiculous comparisons to the CEO's salary bracket versus the women in other roles? I think we should definitely take a pause with respect to the pay gap stuff, because the entirety of that case will be based upon reams and reams and reams of analytics and documentation for how determinations were made. And Activision Blizzard, you might hate them. They might be crazy. They might be doing all this bad stuff on the harassment side. It would surprise the heck out of me if they didn't document themselves and follow best practices to avoid the direct discrimination claims that the state of California makes. So that'll be based on a lot of data that we don't have, that California probably doesn't have on a case-by-case basis. And so we got to wait on that to see how that goes. Great content. What are you playing on your Switch? What am I playing on my Switch right now? Oh, you know what? This is a great segue to talk about what I am playing right now, and then I'll try to think about what I'm playing on my Switch. I'm playing a game right now on my Xbox that I am absolutely adoring, that I hadn't heard of, really, until this past week, and I love it when that happens. And if you haven't heard of it, it gives my 2 thumbs up, probably will appear on my Game of the Year list recommendation, The Forgotten City. And it's primarily a dialogue-based role-playing game that takes place in a single city where every character has a robust dialogue tree, and it takes place in a time loop where you're trying to figure out what's going on. And, you know, not to sound like the announcer guy on commercials, but there's much more going on than meets the eye. And it's clearly done by a smallish team. It's got kind of some indie polish issues. But if you can get around that, it is one of the best experiences I have had this year, with some of the best writing that I have read this year. It's almost like, if you like The Good Place, it's like an ethics class and a philosophy class at the same time as it's this dialogue role-playing game character thing. The Forgotten City gets my most heartfelt recommendations, and when I beat it, when I can confirm that it lands the plane, I'll probably be doing something like a, I don't know, Hoeg Law recommends 5 minutes on this, because this came out of absolutely nowhere to me, and I could not be loving it more right now. So absolutely recommended. Check it out if you're at all interested in what I just said. Now, what am I playing on the Switch? So my girl's been playing There Is No Game again, which we really loved the first time that we played it in the winter. And then I think most recently on the Switch, I have been playing Legend of Mana, the remake of the old PlayStation, what is that? Original PlayStation game. And certainly had a great time with it. Forgotten City isn't like Disco Elysium. Disco Elysium has a lot more role-playing game elements. This is a lot more like a first-person shooter in a BioWare world without shooting, mostly. And it's a design that I'm not sure I have seen before, so it's harder to describe than that. It lives on its writing, it lives on its storytelling, both of which are well above average. So it does share that with Disco Elysium. But absolutely fantastic. I think it was 30 on the Xbox. As you could tell from my effusive praise, couldn't recommend it more. It is going to be something that's not going to give you that visceral thrill. So if you're looking to shoot things Doom style, that's not going to happen. And it's primarily dialogue and interesting questions and dealing with problems. But because of the time loop, because of what they do there, you can screw up conversations and know that this person reacts negatively to this kind of stuff and try again on the next loop in a fashion that is really interesting to try to get everything together and figure out what's going on. And it's it's a game. It's not just a walking simulator or something like that, but it's a game premised on dialogue and personality, and is absolutely fantastic. Let's see here. And 5 or so minute warning. So if you got questions, get them in, and we'll try to go through them as they come here. Let's see where I left off. Number of law firms are investigating Activision Blizzard for breach of fiduciary duty. What effect does this potentially have on addressing to the California case? None. When you've got a stock shortfall, when you've got a major state or government action like we saw here, it is very, very normal for plaintiffs, law firms to say, hey, we're opening up an investigation on whether or not these people have squandered your money. And that's a breach of fiduciary duty. And so that's normal. In fact, I mentioned it in one of the videos in the Activision Blizzard series. That's kind of how our system in the United States is designed to be. That rather than the SEC that just doesn't have enough bodies to really police everything, we effectively have mercenaries that have money that they can go get if they can identify problems at the securities level for these companies. And that's what plaintiffs' law firms that specialize in securities do. So they're doing the right thing, and we don't know what'll come out of that. But they're motivated by money, and so they'll be motivated by investigations as well. Did you ever get around to Judgment? That's funny you should ask. I just started playing that again to try to get ready for Lost Judgment. So we will see. I got about halfway through first time. Excellent game, but I got to play through it again. Let's see. Morning objection. It's 5 p.m., sir. See, I love how global we are. If you could see my analytics, the YouTube tells me that for the first time earlier this year, we passed 51%, and I think it's gotten higher now for non-U.S. Viewers and subscribers of the channel, which I think is awesome. But I have to try to remind myself to either mention that I'm a U.S. attorney and a Michigan attorney specifically, or to talk about things as if they're only United States jurisdiction and to reference that as well. And it's just something that I have to get used to a little bit more in these videos. Should I use ad blocker for YouTube? YouTube is not terminating channels for using ad blocker. I don't know. That's up to you. I mean, people ask me questions about why ads appear in my videos. You know, one of the reasons is because I'm using, it's fair use. We're talking about news items, and I'm never using the whole article, and I'm linking them in the description, all that good stuff. But I am using the work of these services. So I always keep the ads on, which I know bothers some of you, because I think that's the right thing to do for what I'm using them for. But in terms of your use case, I think you got to make that determination for yourself. Does the recent court case make the college football game unlikely? No, makes it vastly more likely. You're talking about Alston? So you can go check out my Alston video. But no, the NCAA losing its Supreme Court case, the NIL stuff happening in basically chaotic fashion means that there is now an opportunity for basically the players to have a generalized ability to sell their likenesses to the EAs of the world. The NCAA game in, I think it's currently thought to be 2023, is now significantly more likely to happen and happen in a way that you might like if you like that game than it was before last month. So no, it's much more likely now. Why do you think the First Amendment should protect companies and not only citizens? Companies are working with different laws, pay different taxes, and they cannot speak in the same meaning as citizens. Well, you know, you can go and you can look at the court cases here, but primarily the existence of the corporate form and the limited liability company form is designed to arrive at allowing the combination of assets, because there are economies of scale and there's usefulness for sharing resources in getting things done. It's hard to imagine some of the big breakthroughs that we would have had with technology or otherwise without getting those things done, with having piles of money. And so the corporate form is essentially just people working together. We call it a legal fiction. They don't exist. They're pieces of paper. You saw that reference in Bobby Kotick's statement from Activision Blizzard. But just because they don't exist doesn't mean that the people that have given their money to this end don't have the right to say things, don't have the other constitutional rights that they have. And you can see this a little bit more easily if you imagine something like the New York Times, right? The New York Times has its breadth, had its ability to get out to people in the fashion that it did because it's a corporation, because people that wanted this thing to go, to have news out there, put their money in to get the printing presses working, to get out there now with the world of the internet, to have enough authors, to have the marketing that they need. And so if you were to not extend the rights of those people that funded that entity to the entity itself, you would essentially be locking out not only the breadth of the economy, but also everything that you think you know about news or press or informational sources. Because once the company loses it, you know, I'm operating here through Hoeg Law. And now that's owned by me in its entirety, but that's an entity. And so if you take away that, you'd say, well, can I speak through Hoeg Law? Can I Can I talk through that? Does it have to be me individually? And I don't think that that makes a lot of sense for the jurisprudence, either of the time at the signing of the Constitution, or what would make sense to best protect the rights of the people that have given their money to these entities. So that's my answer. It's a little bit short form. That's probably a whole course in law school. But I'm glad you asked the question, and maybe we can talk about it again on another one. All right. Questions that are in right now are the last questions. So we'll be stopping at, did you watch WWE Smackdown yesterday? But I will cover these because we're having fun here. And let's talk about what we've got right now. Did you already answer the question on the Disney lawsuit this morning? Just join, so ignore if you did. But if not, what if Disney decided to simply give the movie out for subscribers at no additional dollars? Well, I don't think I answered that specific question in this space. Chances are it would be the same type of arguments. The Premier Access stuff doesn't change the fundamental argument that the Johansson side is making, right? They're saying that a wide theatrical release is only wide and theatrical and not anything else. Disney says, no, we can do Premier Access, we can do Disney Plus. If Disney took the movie and handed out the DVDs, as they use in their example, at the movie doors, you would have the same argument. You'd have the same fight, because the Johansson team is saying, and I think rightly so, that those kinds of behaviors undercut the box office ticket receipts. And we negotiated this contract on the understanding that there would be a certain amount of standardness to the way this movie would be sold and marketed. So that's how we can agree on we get X% of the theatrical tickets. If you undercut that, then we've got a problem. And Disney can say, yeah, well, then you should have written that in the contract. But certainly Disney looks kind of scummy in all this stuff. And I'm not saying that they don't. When I talk about the legal issues and the contract issues, that's not discounting how Disney looks on this score. It's just saying, I'm not sure that the contract case is as strong as they are presenting it to be. Yeah, I see. I meant how bad will it look to the court when California presents the ridiculous gender pay gap argument with regards to the CEO. I don't think they'll present it that way. I think that was just part of the early paragraph. You'll probably see Activision Blizzard fight it in their counter, which will happen pretty shortly, I would think. But I'm not sure it would get to the trial level at that. Would that not be tortious interference? I don't know what we're referring to. The Big 12 is accusing ESPN of tortious interference. There's some other tortious interference being claimed, excuse me, just as part of this video. Let's see. I started Ace Attorney Chronicles on Switch, so great to get back into this universe. Love Ace Attorney. Love Ace Attorney. We're still a couple cases back on the last one, which I think is Trials and Tribulations. So I'll be finishing up that with my girls, actually. My girls love Ace Attorney. And then we'll be moving on to Ace Attorney Chronicles. So we'll see on that. On the topic of gambling, how do you feel about the issue of gambling conglomerate being behind Raid Shadow Legends and essentially marketing gambling to children? Yeah, I don't know that story. I know Raid Shadow Legends has been kind of a meme-style joke here in YouTube. I did, I arrived when I got the email that asked me to do a sponsorship for Raid Shadow Legends, so that felt good at the channel. I didn't do it, obviously, as you could probably tell. Yeah, I mean, I think gambling, loot boxes, slot machine mechanics, all that kind of stuff, I think we're playing with fire with respect to kids and video gaming. I don't know whether the answer to that is regulation or not, but it's certainly something that is untowards, and it makes the industry look bad. So, I don't know the answer to that question. My feelings are complicated because I do think video games have a place in lives that aren't just children's, and I think when you have that acknowledgement, there's a place for things that aren't just children facing. And I think we have to be careful about not just allowing senators and Congress people in general to go out there and pretend like everything they're talking about with respect to video games is aimed at an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or what have you. I'm still playing video games. I've been playing them for 30 plus years. And, so I think we got to be careful with that, but certainly, even a little bit of self-regulation could help try to avoid those fights. And I think that's necessary. How long do laws take to catch up to new channels of abuse? A while. The laws, what's the phrase? The law grinds slowly but exceedingly fine. It's a sledgehammer, you might have heard me say in an earlier video or in another appearance this last week. It does work, but it takes a long, long time. And certainly we have seen a general delay in having the law apply to internet-facing and computer technology-facing questions. Time loop element almost sounds like Outer Wilds. Yeah, I might like this one a little bit more than that. It's not a timer based occurrence. It's getting things wrong. I don't want to say anything more that will trigger the loop. It's not, you're not feeling rushed as much as I felt in Outer Wilds. And I loved Outer Wilds. You can go see my video on it as one of my top 10 games of that year. But I never really liked the timed element for what's an exploration game. And I don't believe this one has that timed element. Could be wrong. But if it does, it's significantly longer. Could a legit case be manipulated politically and be legal? Don't quite know that. Maybe you're referring to California. I mean, California politicized their case, but certainly it's not without merit just because they did that. So yes, I think the broad answer is probably yes to that one, but I would need a little bit more detail. Where do you see yourself in 5 years, and where do you hope you will be in 5 years? Well, in all honesty, when I left what I was doing to make my own place and to market my own shop and do those kinds of things, that's what I wanted to do. So my next 5 years is continuing to grow this stuff. The channel is a complete surprise. That came out of wanting to market the firm in an interesting way. I wanted to talk with some of my clients a little bit better about what they were seeing and interacting with social media and YouTube and elsewise, and it's become bigger than I thought it would be. So, you know, if this continued to take up more and more of my time, I don't think I would mind it. But I'm doing what I want to do. I'm my own boss. I have my own equity. I control my own day. It's very, very stressful, especially this past 18 months. And so certainly anything that could ease in that stress, generally speaking, smoother business cycles, that kind of thing, would be great. But, this is what I signed up for, and I really don't have many complaints on that. So I think what you'd see is this, more in 5 years, bigger, grander, better, hopefully. But that's really what I want to do. Oh, by the way, did you look into the copyright course from Harvard? No, I don't know what that's about. I'll have to look into it. And did you watch Smackdown yesterday? I did not. I watched wrestling for maybe a year or two when I was in high school, and never really watched it from then. There was one wrestler who wanted to sign a contract for a title match that another wrestler knocked them out and just signed the contract himself. Seems illegal. Yeah, if you have an existing contract, unless you haven't filled in party names, it's probably already named for a specific party. And definitely the act of having a contract requires offer and acceptance. And that offer, whatever it was made by, whether it was WWE or otherwise, probably wasn't extended to the gentleman who knocked out the contracting party and signed it for himself. So I think, I don't like to give legal opinions, obviously, in this space, but I think that particular analysis that seems illegal in that respect, I think it was probably not a valid contract. So that's everything for me today in July questions and answers question time. Thank you so much. This has been a great set of questions today. Thank you so much to our patrons for asking the questions that they did. If you're interested in making sure that your questions get answered at the top of one of these videos, please do consider supporting the channel on Patreon at that question time tier. Or hey, if you want to see your name on a monthly basis, or if you want to sponsor a specific episode where I just talk about you, we've got tiers for that on Patreon as well. Thank you so much to everybody who has talked with me this morning, who's put in those questions, who's helped support the channel. I'm so thankful. Don't forget the Forgotten City. It's amazing. And I will see you on the very next episode of Virtual Legality. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend and the rest of your day.